My name is Dennis Coleman. I'm 71 years old, and 2 days after my daughter told me, in front of nearly 100 of her husband's business associates, that I was an embarrassment to this family, a lawyer called to inform me that an old friend had named me executor of an estate worth considerably more than anyone in my family understood I was even capable of managing. Welcome to Silent Honor, where we tell true stories about the quiet strength it takes to be underestimated by the people who need you most, and still choose to show up for them anyway. If you've ever been made to feel small by someone whose opinion mattered more to you than it probably should have, this story is for you. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. And hit subscribe, because you're going to want to see exactly what happened in the days after that phone call. Let me start where this really begins. I spent 38 years working as a machinist and eventually a plant foreman at a manufacturing facility outside Toledo. Honest, physical work that never once required a suit or a boardroom. Work that let me raise my daughter Melissa in a modest but comfortable home after her mother, my wife Diane, passed from ovarian cancer when Melissa was just 14 years old. I raised her alone through her teenage years, showing up to every school function I could manage around shift work, doing my best with a kind of parenting nobody had properly prepared me for. Melissa grew up, went to college on a combination of scholarships and loans I helped her manage carefully, and eventually built a genuinely impressive career in corporate finance. Married a man named Gregory whose family runs in circles considerably more polished than the modest, working-class world I raised her in. Over the years since her wedding, I noticed Melissa's relationship to that working-class background growing increasingly complicated, a discomfort I understood, in a general sense, without ever fully appreciating how deep it actually ran until 2 days before that lawyer called. There was a moment, maybe 3 years into her marriage, when Melissa mentioned, almost in passing during a phone call, that she'd told a group of Gregory's colleagues that I'd worked in manufacturing management, a phrase technically true, but carefully softened from the more direct machinist and plant foreman description I'd always used myself. I noticed the softening at the time and told myself it was simply how younger professionals sometimes translated older generation careers for unfamiliar audiences. A harmless enough habit that didn't particularly concern me. There was a Christmas dinner the following year when Gregory's mother asked, with polite curiosity, about my career, and Melissa answered for me before I could speak, describing my work in vaguer, more corporate-sounding terms than I'd have used myself, a pattern I noticed repeating itself often enough over subsequent gatherings that I eventually stopped correcting it, telling myself, the way people in my position often do, that it wasn't worth the friction to insist on more precise language. I want to be careful here, because I don't think Melissa is a cruel person, and I don't want this story to sound like a simple indictment of her character. She spent years building a life and an identity that required, in her own mind at least, a certain amount of distance from the plain, unglamorous circumstances she grew up in, and I think, somewhere along the way, that distance started including me directly, not just the memory of the house I raised her in. The specific evening everything came to a head was a milestone anniversary gala for Gregory's family's company, a lavish event held at a downtown hotel ballroom, celebrating 50 years since Gregory's grandfather founded the business. Melissa had asked me to attend weeks in advance, genuinely wanting me there, and I'd looked forward to it, purchasing a new suit specifically for the occasion, wanting to represent her well among people whose world I understood was considerably different from my own. I arrived that evening in my good suit, feeling reasonably confident, and spent the first hour or so making pleasant, if somewhat stilted conversation with various guests, doing my genuine best to navigate a social environment I understood wasn't naturally my own. About midway through the evening, during a lull in conversation near the bar, one of Gregory's business associates, a man I'd just been introduced to, asked me, with polite curiosity, what kind of work I'd done before retiring. 38 years at a manufacturing plant, I said. Machinist, then plant foreman toward the end there. Honest work, kept my hands busy. The man nodded politely enough, and the conversation moved on to other topics, nothing that felt, to me, like any kind of significant moment. But I noticed, later that evening, that Melissa had overheard at least part of that exchange, and something in her expression, watching from across the room, had shifted into a tightness I recognized from her teenage years, the particular look she used to get when she felt embarrassed by something outside her control. Near the end of the evening, as guests were beginning to depart, Melissa pulled me aside into a quiet hallway outside the main ballroom, her voice low but sharp, in a way I hadn't heard directed at me in years. "Dad, did you really need to tell Marcus Whitfield about the plant?" In those exact words, machinist, then plant foreman. Do you understand what kind of people are in that room tonight? Gregory's entire professional network, people who could genuinely matter for his career, and you're out there talking about factory work like it's something to be proud of at an event like this. I want to be honest about what I felt hearing that, standing in that quiet hallway in my new suit, having genuinely tried all evening to represent my daughter well among people I understood weren't naturally part of my world. "Melissa," I said, "it is something to be proud of. I fed you, clothed you, put you through college on that exact work, most of it after your mother passed, doing it alone. I'm not going to pretend it was something else to make Gregory's business associates more comfortable. That's not what I'm asking you to do," she said, her voice rising slightly now. "I'm asking you to have some basic awareness of the room you're in. You're an embarrassment to this family, Dad, standing there talking about assembly lines like we're still living in that tiny house on Beecher Street. Gregory's mother actually asked me afterward if you were doing all right financially, like you needed some kind of charity. Do you understand how that makes us look?" I didn't have an immediate response to that. I want to tell you honestly what happened in me in that moment, because I think it matters more than any composed version I might otherwise offer you. Something that had been quietly building for years, a low, persistent awareness of Melissa's growing discomfort with our family's actual history, finally landed with its full weight, standing in that hallway in a suit I'd bought specifically to make her proud, being told, plainly, that I'd embarrassed her simply by describing the work that had raised her. "When did factory work become something to be ashamed of, Melissa?" I asked, my voice quieter now but no less firm. I remember a little girl who used to be genuinely proud when I'd bring her to the plant's family day, who used to tell her classmates her dad built things with his hands. I don't know exactly when that pride turned into embarrassment, but I'd like to understand it, if you're willing to explain. "It's not that simple, Dad," she said, and I could hear, underneath the sharpness, something closer to genuine distress. "You don't understand what it's like, constantly trying to prove I belong in Gregory's world, constantly feeling like one wrong detail could confirm what some of these people probably already suspect about where I actually came from." "I understand exactly how it makes you look, Melissa," I said quietly. "It makes you look like the daughter of a man who worked with his hands for 38 years to give you every opportunity you've built your current life on. I'm sorry that apparently embarrasses you." I left shortly after that, driving home in silence, the specific quiet weight of that phrase, an embarrassment to this family, settling into my chest in a way I didn't fully examine until I was sitting alone in my own kitchen an hour later. Let me pause the story right here for just a second, because I want to ask you something, watching at home right now. Have you ever been told, plainly, by someone you love, that the honest work you did to build their entire life had somehow become something to be ashamed of? How did you carry that, and did anyone ever come back to acknowledge what that comment actually cost you? Tell me in the comments, because I read every single one, and if this story is already feeling familiar, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now, because what happened 2 days later is the part of this story you really don't want to miss. 2 days after that gala, on a Thursday afternoon, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, a local area code but nothing familiar attached to it. I almost let it go to voicemail, still carrying some residual heaviness from the weekend, but something made me answer. "Mr. Coleman? Dennis Coleman?" Speaking. "My name is Patricia Vance. I'm an attorney handling the estate of Harold Whitcomb. I understand you and Mr. Whitcomb were close friends for a number of years. I want to tell you honestly what happened in me hearing that name, because I think it matters considerably to understanding everything that followed. Harold Whitcomb had been my closest friend for nearly 4 decades, a man I'd met on the factory floor early in my career, back when he was just another machinist working the line beside me. Long before a series of shrewd, patient investments in local real estate and small manufacturing ventures had quietly transformed him, over 30 years, into a considerably wealthy man, a transformation he'd carried with the same modest, unassuming manner he'd always had, never once changing how he dressed, or spoke, or treated the people who'd known him before the money arrived. Harold and I had stayed close throughout all of it, fishing together most weekends for decades, our friendship never once complicated by the growing disparity in our financial circumstances, because Harold never once let that disparity change how he treated me, and I never once let it change how I treated him. Harold passed away 3 days ago, Patricia Vance told me. A heart attack, quite sudden. I'm calling because Mr. Whitcombs will name you as executor of his estate, Mr. Coleman, a role that comes with some significant responsibilities I'll need to walk you through, given the scope of what we're actually discussing here. The scope? I asked, genuinely uncertain what she meant. Mr. Coleman, she said, Harold Whitcomb's estate is valued at just over $14 million, spread across various properties, business holdings, and investment accounts. He specifically named you as executor, ahead of several family members who might otherwise have expected that role, and left a personal letter explaining his reasoning that I'm required to share with you directly, in person, at your earliest convenience. I sat down slowly at my own kitchen table, absorbing information that reshaped, in the space of a single phone call, my understanding of not just Harold's life, but my own position within it. I'd known Harold was comfortable, certainly. I'd never fully appreciated the actual scale of what 4 decades of patient, disciplined investing had actually built, because Harold, in the specific, quiet way that had always characterized our friendship, had simply never made a show of it, the same way I'd never made a show of my own modest, steady life. I met with Patricia Vance 2 days later, at her office downtown, and she handed me a letter Harold had apparently written nearly a year earlier, updated periodically as his health began declining. A letter I want to describe carefully, because its contents matter enormously to understanding everything that happened afterward. Dennis, the letter began, in Harold's familiar, careful handwriting. If you're reading this, I've gone on ahead of you, and I imagine you're sitting somewhere absorbing news that probably feels considerably larger than anything either of us expected our friendship to eventually involve. I want you to understand why I chose you, specifically, over my own children, for this responsibility. My kids grew up comfortable, Dennis, in a way neither of us ever did, and somewhere along the way, comfort taught them to measure people by things that never once mattered to either of us on that factory floor. You've spent your whole life treating people the same regardless of what they had or didn't have, and I trust you, more than anyone else I know, to handle what I've built with the same integrity you've always carried, rather than letting it change how you see the people around you. The letter continued for 2 more pages, Harold's careful handwriting growing slightly less steady toward the end, clearly written across multiple sittings as his health declined. He recounted, in detail I hadn't expected, specific memories from our early years together on the factory floor. The time I'd covered his shift without complaint when his first daughter was born. The fishing trips that had carried us through both our divorces from difficult first marriages before Diane and Harold's eventual second wife came into our lives. The particular quality of trust that had built, slowly and without any dramatic turning point, over 4 decades of simply showing up for each other consistently. You never once asked me for anything, Dennis. Not when I had nothing, and not after I had considerably more than nothing, the letter continued. That's rarer than you probably realize, and it's exactly why I need someone like you handling what comes next. Someone who won't let a number change how he sees the people this estate actually needs to serve fairly. I want to be honest about what reading that letter did to me. Sitting in that lawyer's office 2 days after being called an embarrassment by my own daughter. Harold, a man who'd built $14 million through decades of quiet, disciplined work, had chosen me, specifically, because of the exact qualities Melissa had apparently decided, at that gala, reflected poorly on our family. The estate's scope required, over the following weeks, considerable public visibility on my part, meetings with Harold's business partners, coordination with his children regarding various properties and holdings, a level of formal, documented responsibility that meant, inevitably, word of my role began circulating through exactly the kind of social circles Melissa had been so concerned about impressing at that gala. I want to describe what happened when Melissa found out, because it's the actual heart of this story, more than the estate itself or the comment that preceded it. Gregory's father, it turned out, had done business with Harold Whitcomb decades earlier, a connection I hadn't known about until Patricia Vance mentioned, during our second meeting, that several of the estate's business holdings overlapped with companies Gregory's family had partnered with previously. Word reached Gregory's family, and eventually Melissa herself, that I was managing an estate considerably larger than anything most of the guests at that anniversary gala likely controlled themselves. Melissa called me about 3 weeks after that initial lawyer's phone call, her voice carrying a tone I hadn't heard from her in the hallway at that gala, something closer to genuine confusion than the sharp certainty she'd carried that evening. "Dad," she said, "Gregory's father mentioned something about you handling Harold Whitcomb's estate. Is that actually true? The Harold Whitcomb who owns half the commercial property on the east side of downtown?" "That's the one," I said. "We were friends for almost 40 years, Melissa, since before either of us had 2 nickels to rub together." "I didn't know you were that close with him," she said. "I mean, I knew you two went fishing sometimes, but I had no idea the actual scope of his—" She paused, clearly working through the specific discomfort of reconciling what she'd apparently assumed about my life with what she was now learning about it. "I know," I said. "I never made much of it, because Harold never made much of it either. That's actually part of why he trusted me with this, Melissa. Neither of us ever needed the other to perform wealth or status for the friendship to matter." She was quiet for a long moment. "Dad, at the gala, when I said what I said, I remember exactly what you said," I told her, keeping my voice level but not softening the moment either. "I've been thinking about it a lot since Gregory's dad mentioned Harold's name," she said. "I think I've spent years assuming that the plain, working-class version of you was the whole picture, and I built an entire sense of embarrassment around that assumption, without ever actually questioning whether it was complete. And now I'm finding out you were close friends with one of the wealthiest men in this entire region, and he trusted you, specifically you, over people with considerably more financial sophistication, because of exactly the qualities I apparently decided were embarrassing." Let me pause again for just a moment, because I think this next part matters considerably. I want to be honest that hearing Melissa arrive at that realization didn't erase what she'd said in that hallway. I didn't rush to reassure her that it was fine, that I understood, that the comment hadn't actually cost me anything. "Melissa," I said, "I appreciate you sitting with that. But I need you to understand something important. My worth was never actually contingent on Harold's estate, or on any dollar figure I might eventually be associated with. I was the exact same man in that hallway 2 days before that phone call as I am now, having lunch with attorneys about $14 million. The only thing that's actually changed is your awareness of a number. If the number is what makes you reconsider whether I was an embarrassment, I think that reveals something considerably more troubling than the original comment itself." She didn't have an immediate response to that, and I let the silence sit, the way I'd learned to let silences sit throughout decades of factory floor conversations where the most important things often arrived only after the easy words had run out. "You're right," she said finally, her voice smaller now. "I think I need to actually sit with that, Dad. Not just apologize for the gala, but actually examine why a number changed anything about how I see you, when it shouldn't have needed to change anything at all." The weeks that followed were their own kind of complicated. There's a version of this story where that phone call is the climax, and everything after is a footnote. But that's not how these things actually resolve, and I want to be honest about that. Real resolution is slow. It's Melissa asking, over several difficult conversations, genuine questions about what had actually shaped her discomfort with our family's working-class history. Questions that led back, eventually, to her own anxieties about fitting into Gregory's world. Anxieties she'd apparently been carrying since well before that gala. Anxieties that had, over years, quietly reshaped how she talked about her own upbringing. There was an afternoon, about a month after the estate settled into its formal management structure, when Melissa asked if she could accompany me to one of my regular meetings with the estate's property managers, wanting, she said, to actually understand what the responsibility involved, rather than simply hearing about it secondhand through Gregory's father's social circles. I think I've spent years measuring my own worth by Gregory's family's standards, she admitted, sitting in my truck afterward, watching the property manager's office grow smaller in the rearview mirror. And somewhere in that measuring, I started applying the same standard to you, without ever asking whether it was actually a fair or accurate way to see either of us. I watched my daughter, in the months after that, do something I hadn't fully seen her do before. At a subsequent family gathering, when Gregory's mother made an offhand comment about old money versus new money among some mutual acquaintances, Melissa said, without hesitation, "My father spent 38 years doing honest physical work to raise me alone after my mother passed, and he's currently managing a $14 million estate because his oldest friend trusted his integrity over anyone else's financial credentials. I'd take that kind of character over old money any day of the week." I didn't feel triumphant when the whole situation finally settled. I want to be honest about that too. I felt tired, the particular tired that comes after finally naming something that had needed naming for far too long. I thought about Harold a great deal in those weeks, and about Diane, wondering what she would have made of watching our daughter finally reckon with an assumption she'd carried, largely unexamined, for years. It's been almost a year now since that gala. Melissa calls regularly. Genuine conversations that have grown considerably more honest than the careful, managed politeness that characterized much of our relationship in the years before that hallway conversation. She stopped, entirely, the specific habit of describing my working-class background as something to manage or minimize in front of Gregory's social circles, and I've noticed her, on more than one occasion, actively correcting others who make similar assumptions. The estate work continues, considerably more demanding than I'd anticipated when Patricia Vance first called, but genuinely meaningful, a final act of trust from a friend who'd understood, better than my own daughter had at that gala, exactly what my character was actually worth. I think about that hallway conversation often now, sitting in my own kitchen some evenings, the same table where I first absorbed the news about Harold's estate. How much of the people we love we simply stop actively seeing clearly? Not because we've decided they don't matter, but because we've absorbed, somewhere along the way, an external standard that quietly reshapes what we're willing to be proud of. Melissa didn't set out to be cruel that evening. She'd simply absorbed, over years of navigating Gregory's world, a set of values that made my honest, working-class history feel like a liability rather than the exact foundation her own opportunities had been built on. I don't regret standing firm in that hallway, refusing to apologize for describing the work that had actually raised her. I want to say that plainly, because I know some people hearing this will wonder why I didn't simply smooth over the moment to avoid a lasting rift. I think some comments require exactly that kind of firm, unapologetic response, honestly delivered in the moment, rather than a quick accommodation that lets the underlying disrespect go unnamed and unexamined. What I've learned, watching my daughter genuinely reckon with her own assumptions over these past months, is that sometimes the people we love need to be shown, plainly, that our worth was never actually contingent on a number they happen to discover later, and that if a number is what finally makes them reconsider their disrespect, the real work isn't celebrating that they've come around. It's helping them understand why they needed the number at all. If this story reminded you of a moment when someone you love called your honest life an embarrassment, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you believe every honest, hardworking parent deserves to be seen clearly, regardless of any number attached to their name, hit subscribe, because we've got a new story like this one for you every single week.